Are you able to see my screen okay? It seems like you were able to see the earwig, so.
We see the note page, next slide page. So if you want to share the speaker page.
Is that better? Are you seeing it full screen now?
That is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here talking about vegetable pests and pollinators. Let's see here. Hopefully, it can advance for me. Okay, that advanced. Okay, I apologize for the questions here. Okay, awesome.
Good.
Yeah, like Darren said, I serve as an extension entomologist in the Tri-River area. Extension entomologists get to do a lot of very interesting things. In one capacity or another, celebrating my 11th year at CSU. I started as an undergraduate and did my graduate work there, and now I'm lucky enough to be employed by this institution. Yeah, it's you never really stop learning, doing what I get to do, and I'm grateful to share it with all of you tonight. I've been a part of agriculture in a chosen way. I was not born into ag, but I was fascinated by plants and insects at an early age. I started farming in 2008, and I became obsessed with growing food and learning about basically where food comes from. And I learned a lot of job skills doing this, and it provided me a career. I'm really grateful to get to work here in Western Colorado. And it's quite an interesting climate to grow food in. It's one of the more challenging climates to grow food. We have a very extreme climate. It's dependent a lot on our annual precipitation, different pests that roll in from the south, and of course our weather. Before I launch into vegetable pests, I just want to talk about the benefits of insects. They play a vital role in almost every ecosystem on the planet. They're the bottom of the food chain. They are they're helping plants reproduce by pollinating them. So plants are very dependent on their animal pollinators. There's insects that are decomposers of manure and carrion. We don't want those things hanging around in the world for longer than they need to. So insects help to break those down into usable nutrients and are recyclers of nutrients. So in addition to that, many of them are predators and are considered to be good biology. So natural enemies that can help fight against insects that we don't want in the landscape. They help to suppress those populations. They're food for humans and other organisms, and they provide us many products. Of course, pollinators we'll be touching on in depth at the end of the presentation. But our fruits, our vegetables, many of them, nearly a third of the world's plants depend on insect pollinators. Many of our pollinators help to pollinate things like even alfalfa that is then fed into cattle. So if you eat beef, you can thank pollinators. But many crops are dependent on insect pollinators. All insects are arthropods. And arthropods were the first animals to swim in the oceans and to evolve to walk on land and to fly in the skies. They were really the first to interact with plants and fungi many, many years ago. But arthropods all have jointed legs. They have segmented bodies and an exoskeleton. I like to call it their suit of armor. So they have an exoskeleton. We have an endoskeleton. So exoskeletons, the hard stuff's on the outside, soft stuff's on the inside. It's opposite for us. We have all of our soft stuff on the outside and our hard bones on the inside. So we're endoskeletons. And of course, arthropods shed that exoskeleton and they molt. They outgrow that hard exterior and they have to start anew by escaping that through molting. So there's many arthropods, arachnids, of course, so spiders, ticks, scorpions. We have crustaceans like our familiar the insects of the sea, as I sometimes call them. They're a sister group, but they are crabs, our lobsters, our shrimp, and of course, hexapods, the insects, beetles, flies, and of course, myriapods, so centipedes and millipedes. So those are the arthropods. And we'll be discussing today class Insecta. So insects make up more than 70% of the described animal life on the planet. So you can't call yourself an animal lover unless you love insects. So keep that in mind. Most of the described animal kingdom are invertebrates. All insects undergo metamorphosis. Some metamorphosis is more complicated. So complete metamorphosis, there's a total change from larvae to adult in the appearance, and incomplete metamorphosis is really, there's less of a change. The young look more like the adults, and since a matter of time, I'll move forward through that. But we've got some insect life stages here. I've drawn some eggs, larvae, so the feeding stage, the pupa, or the pupal stage, the transformation stage, and then the adult, which is often winged. So what you're all here for, vegetable pests. I want to discuss a little bit on integrated pest management today. I'll be touching on lots of themes about this approach to management, but it's really an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on the long term. Things like biology are used, biocontrol, so certain insects and bacteria and fungi are used in a biological way to control pest species. And monitoring, is so critical to IPM. So just sitting and learning some information about some of the insects that you can encounter is the first step, but really going out into the garden and actively looking for and intercepting what is there is a huge part of IPM. So we've got 5 common indoor vegetable pests. I want to talk a little bit about the indoor pests first. So we've got aphids, fungus gnats, thrips, whiteflies, and psyllids. This is just kind of a visual of all of those. But when you're growing indoors, often space is limited. This is a good example of a greenhouse I've worked out of where there's virtually no space for anything. And so plants are in high density, and that can absolutely increase your instance of pest pressure. And then when things grow big, you really have problems because everything's overlapping. It's creating a perfect environment for some of those indoor pests to thrive. So I do want to go through some indoor pests that are actually not insects. So these are both mites, so they are arachnids, so they are arthropods, but they're not insects. So we have the tube-spotted spider mite, that's a figure drawing, and then eriophyid mites. So spider mites and eriophyid mites are big groups of mites that do interact with plants, and they can alter plants in a way that are detrimental. So it's worth to pay attention to these two. I'm going to go through the two-spotted spider mite first. This is virtually one of the most common pests in vegetable production worldwide. It has hundreds of documented plant hosts, and they're very, very small. They're just barely visible to the human eye, but they make destructive flecks. So their mouth parts pierce those plant cells and remove chlorophyll. And it leaves this eggplant, for example, a plant without the needed components to grow. So it's taken out, it's sucked out that chlorophyll, and this plant is now going to struggle to survive. Spider mites make really distinctive flecking wounds, as you saw in the last slide, and also they navigate by traveling along a network of webbing that is very noticeable on plant leaves. Here's a slightly more enlarged photo. It shows some mites that you can see. It's a little blurry, but there's also some circular, they look like little bubbles. Those are actually spider mite eggs. They lay very large eggs. So we were able to see all of that just by taking a photo. So spider mite management, you really want to monitor those higher risk plants. So lots of our vegetables, you want to minimize drought stress, increase humidity. And so you just want to take particular care, of course, with pesticides that you're going to use as well when you are going to be applying this. But, currently there's a few over-the-counter options. Horticultural oils are a typical one that I will recommend to folks. This is a mode of action that actually drowns the mites in that oil. It's often cottonwood seed oil. And there's others, but there's certain dusts that are dry and they're to be applied dried. Bifenthrin, so that's a pyrethroid. So this is a contact group. Other pyrethroids. These are broad spectrum products that are not very selective. So they're going to take out a lot of the good biology as well if you use something like a pyrethroid. Predators, I'm not talking a lot about predators today, but there's a few slides I just had to point a few of our heroes out. We've got predator thrips in the bottom right. And of course, there are minute pirate bugs. That top left corner shows one eating a thrips. But there are some really good insects that, it's eating, in the top corner, it's eating a thrips, that minute pirate bug, but it eats aphids. It also eats spider mites. So that's more of a generalist predator that goes around, and whatever it can overpower and eat for lunch, it will do so. So we want to thank some of the good biology that's doing work to suppress those pests. But drought stress greatly contributes to spider mite problems. So you can see that plant, on the left has significant damage, and it had been drought stressed. So, and those are morning glories, I believe, at Whitney Cranshaw's house, who was my advisor in graduate school, and should have given him photo credit. So I'll verbalize that here. I want to move on to thrips. So thrips, it's like the word scissors. It's always plural. So even when you're talking about one, but there's many species of thrips. There was one just found, I think it was in Florida. They're worried about it's a new invasive species. So, but they're not just flower feeders. That's what they primarily do. They do feed on foliage, and they're very, very small. They are visible to the human eye, but just barely so. And they're all named for those feather-like wings. They've got rasping mouth parts. And the biggest thing with thrips to pay attention to is that they are a vector of diseases, especially in vegetable production. Too many to name just in a sentence, but thrips need to be controlled for that very reason, is because they are a primary vector of many viruses and bacterium as well. So we've got two thrips here, our most common species in Colorado, the western flower thrips on the left and the onion thrips on the right. These are our most common. Here's some thrips life stages. You can see there's many nymphal stages where they're not winged. And this is when they're primarily feeding on the plant, causing a lot of that damage, is when they're in those younger stages. After the egg, more on the left-hand side of the screen. Here's some damage on onion, and you can see it looks like the onion has some dust stuck to it, and those are mainly thrips. They're very tiny. So, problem thrips in Colorado vegetable production, it's the fact that they vector so many pathogens. So one that's, a big one that stuck out to me last year was the tomato spotted wilt virus, but I believe these tomatoes on the left have. But they can make very healthy plants very sick very quickly. And these are, I'd say, the top 5 pathogens that thrips do vector that we need to be aware of when we're producing vegetables. If you want to take a photo of this, you can. I'm not going to necessarily go through each of these one by one. So here's just kind of a summary list for you of some of the problems that thrips can cause. Western flower thrips, here's kind of a photo and linked with some of its damage as well. Thrips leave frass that's very black in color, so their excrement is dark. It's one of the ways we can ID that we have them. If we haven't put out sticky cards in an area that we're growing plants. That's another way to detect that monitoring piece of IPM, making sure that we're always looking for the problem pests, because you'd be surprised when you're not looking, it seems like there's nothing out there, but once you put those sticky cards up, you know a lot more information about what's happening out in your garden or on your farm or in a greenhouse. And of course, onion thrips. But of course, you know, thrips are insect vectors and they feed and get that pathogen on a certain plant that's diseased. And then that virus persists within that thrips and they vector that to a new plant host, making new plants sick. And thrips are very hard to exclude in outdoor settings and possible in indoor settings to exclude thrips, but it's very expensive. And oftentimes our greenhouses are not constructed in a way that as managers, we're able to just simply adapt that greenhouse to exclude thrips. They have to really be built from day one to exclude thrips. There's some exceptions to that, but it's tough to keep them out of certain spaces. So controlling thrips populations, you know, it's really essential. So it does become important to, you know, use some of our tools in our toolbox. So things like insecticides, I would say, depending on the situation, having a big outbreak of thrips would potentially warrant a chemical treatment. You know, it's maybe not the first thing I would jump to, but it's something to highly consider because these can, you know, eliminate people's livelihood. It's very easy for them to have, if a crop fails because you didn't spray for thrips, you're going to really wish that you had considered your options. So, you know, critical to weigh the costs and benefits of that. But like I said, monitoring on sticky cards is very critically important. You get a good idea of other pests indoors as well. So insecticides for thrips, I've mentioned a few, spinosad. There's IGRs or insect growth regulators as well. Azadirachtin, the compound that's the active ingredient in neem oil, that's something that works on thrips as well. So just some ideas. There are some pretty great experiments that have been done using reflective mulches and comparing the colors even used. But removing plant debris, being very clean when you're cleaning your field at the end of the year and rotating your crops, not growing things in the same spot year to year is very important for thrips control. And then, of course, I mentioned some on this, the physical exclusion of thrips to prevent them from entering. Certain screens and physical barriers can be used to keep thrips out of indoor growing spaces. And a lot of tomatoes are produced this way in thrips-free greenhouses because a lot of tomatoes get the viruses that thrips vector. So moving briefly to whiteflies, another indoor pest. So these are definitely an economically important pest. They do vector a few viruses, but for the most part, you identify them. I think they're fairly easy to identify. Often when you hit a plant, you'll see lots of little white flies. That's why they're named that. That once the plant's disturbed, they'll move around, but they hold their wings against their back. Their wings are fairly symmetrical in shape. They're mostly on the undersides of the leaves. Here's the sweet potato white fly. Just thought these were worth mentioning. You can control these with horticultural oil is very commonly used. So talking about earwigs, earwigs are really becoming more of a common issue. They're originally from Europe, so we really only have one species here, the European earwig. Whitney Cranshaw and I have discussed really his idea that he feels that the use of mulch made from wood creates the perfect environment for earwigs, and we use this everywhere, and the incidence of us using that has increased. It's become more popular over the years to use mulches like this, but they seem to be doing very well. Earwigs, the male, have slightly more enlarged cerci off the back than the female, but they're virtually the same besides that. And earwigs are omnivorous. So for the most part, certain times of the year, they're actually going around and they're eating your flowers, and they're eating other insects, and they become especially an issue in cut flower production and in tree fruit when flowers are blooming and when tree fruit becomes ripe. And so all of a sudden this goes from being a friend in the orchard to all of a sudden it starts to eat the fruit. And it becomes a pest. So it's very interesting. So the time of year depends on if you like or despise earwigs. Most people just dislike them because of their common name. I've scoured the literature, and there's not much there to support that they should be named earwigs, just so you know. It's just kind of I don't know who's responsible for that, but here's just some anatomy labeled for you. We've got a lot to get through today, folks. I'm going to be going through some of this fairly quickly. So bug Darren for the recording if you need to go back to any of the slides, or just email me. But these cerci aren't used to pinch you. I do want to state that much. They're used to manipulate their prey, and it helps during mating. The males can help position the females in mating by grasping them in a certain way. So this didn't evolve to hurt humans. There's a greater purpose here for these cerci, so just keep that in mind. And it was just Mother's Day a few weeks ago, and I want to point out earwigs are one of the more maternal insects out there. They actually help do a significant amount to raise their young, and not many insects do this whatsoever. So I think, like Whitney always says, they deserve some credit for being maternal. As I said, they are omnivores, so they do include insects in their diet, but they do eat soft petals and leaves, and they feed at night. So you will go out and all of a sudden things will be lacerated. They look totally chewed up, and it's a mystery to you because you're out every day in your garden looking for what's up. You're doing that monitoring, you're doing that IPM work, but you have no idea what's going on because they're actually feeding at night. So just keep that in mind. Vegetable oil can be used to help trap them, especially on a small scale. It's very effective. So they will drown themselves in it, essentially. And there's different things people will add to vegetable oil. I'm not thinking of the one thing that I wish I could remember on the spot. I'll have to get back to you. But there's things that they add to make it even more attractive to earwigs. And you can catch a significant amount this way, just using vegetable oil. So keep that in mind in the home garden. I want to move to some hemipteran pests. So the true bugs. This is a group where when you say bug, you're not incorrect. Typically all insects are called bugs, and that's not correct because there's a specific group of them that are true bugs, and these are those that have piercing, sucking mouth parts. You can see here in some of my figure drawing and in the photographs that they have jointed, it's almost like a straw off the front of their mouth that they use to either suck the fluids of another insect or of a plant, depending on their biology. So aphids are true bugs. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts. They just sit there on the plant and drink the fluids through that rostrum or that straw-like mouth part. And it harms the plant. One mouth part by one mouth part, when there's enough of them in there, it's a significant issue. So, they can contaminate produce when in high enough amount, especially brassica aphids. They're really gross. But yeah, reduced vigor, stunted growth from, sustained feeding. Their frass or their excrement, it's sticky. It's a sugary material. They can't digest all that sugar, so they just poop it out, and that can be a significant issue. There's certain molds that grow on that can be an issue. They distort new growth. So often when in the spring on certain trees and on some of our garden plants, we see leaf curls. And if you look in there, you often find aphids, and that is just them messing with the growth of that plant. And of course, they're important because they do transmit certain viruses. And of course, this is an example of them contaminating produce. I have never been able to successfully, I've grown a lot of plants. I've not really been able to pull off Brussels sprouts without using some type of chemical management or growing them under very secure row covers. That's one time I've seen it very successful. And they weren't my plants, but I've seen it happen. It can be done. But that honeydew production, here's a photo of them. They poop a lot. It's really significant. Let's see. Here's a list I've generated. This is some of what I consider the top aphids that you'll encounter in vegetable production. I'm not going to go through each one, but just keep in mind that there are several. Many aphids are host specific, and many of them are asexual in how they reproduce. But certain ones do get sexual forms, and some do overwinter as eggs. It depends on the type of aphid, but most of them really hit either a group of plants that are related or just a few plants or one. They're picky. They're host specific in that way. They seek only a few hosts, if not just one. Here's some aphids on eggplant I discovered. These were green peach aphids. So they're really considered one of the top vegetable pests, indoors and outdoors. Their biology makes it really complicated to manage. Here's just a few I'm highlighting in photos. So the bean aphid here, that one's getting a real good drink into the midrib of that leaf, that main vein. And then of course, brassica aphids or cabbage aphids. They're my least favorite insect. I'm not sure why. I think I just have washed a lot of kale in my life or something, but they're not a pleasant thing to witness and to see all over your plants. And one of the most common aphids I see on so many hosts that are vegetable related are green peach aphids. Of course, in the peach orchards here in the Grand Valley that I work in, we see lots of green peach aphid damage, but lots of times in vegetable production, it's green peach aphid that we find on various plants. There are some melon aphids to watch out for. Really, for the most part, it's important to know between different aphids, but their control is often the same using a horticultural oil. There's definitely stronger stuff out there too. But there's different levels of response. Some folks will do nothing. And ultimately things will get taken care of. Yeah, I hate to stop this. Let me close my door real quick. Sorry to hear people in the building. In the middle. Sorry, folks. I didn't think there would be anyone in the building, but 4-H. So, anyway, getting back to it, you can treat your plants with water. I have done this successfully. You can just blast them off because aphid mouth parts are all plugged in. So when you use water, it actually destroys them physically. They can't hang on just by their mouth. So there's certain insecticidal soaps that can be used, like MPED. You want to always be aware of phytotoxicity in plants when you use an insecticidal soap. And of course, there's aphicides. So different chemicals are used to kill aphids, and there's several labeled for this as well. I do want to throw out a few predators that do eat aphids, like this aphid predator gall midge, the flower fly larvae. These are aphid feeding as when they're young, and there's a photo of the adult. Lady beetles feed on aphids. The larvae are very hungry for them. They eat many of them. And of course, parasitoid wasps also prey on aphids by inserting an egg into a living aphid, and then it turns it into this mummy. So the one in the bottom is stinging a mummy, so I'm not sure what she's doing, but it's a good photo of how that wasp inserts her egg into an aphid, and then it creates a mummy, and they exit as a wasp. So it's not an aphid anymore once the mommy wasp lays her egg in there. And of course, green lacewings are also ferocious predators of aphids. So I don't want to exclude those. They're very important to know about, and it's one of the reasons. Some of these are the reasons why you want to, consider when you're using a broad spectrum product. These are some of the insects that are out there eating aphids that you don't want to kill. They're definitely doing a good job to help suppress that biology. You just, as the manager, have to decide if what they're doing is enough to not impact your yield or in or impact you in a negative way. So squash bugs, this is a huge issue for the Southwest and especially Western Colorado. Very hard to grow squash bugs or to grow squash because of squash bugs. It's easy to grow squash bugs. But they often require an insecticide or, pretty a strict approach to management using row covers. But these are hemipterans, so they're true bugs. They pierce and suck the fluids of squash. Here are their eggs and their nymphs. You can remove eggs using tape, like in that lower right-hand corner. If you have a little amount of squash, if you have acreage, this won't obviously work for you. But it seems to work in the home garden. The eggs are removed fairly easily. And it's one way to go about it if you find that you've got lots of time. Some folks will go around and just squish the nymphs. But if nothing's done, they damage squash in a profound way, in a way that we will, unfortunately, likely not yield any, if any, there'll be very little squash. It's really tough in my area to grow squash without using a chemical control or without using row covers. It is possible to, especially during the first part of the year when squash bugs are establishing, if you're very detailed and I guess if you are up for a challenge and you have a lot of row cover, you can grow squash this way and exclude them by growing squash underneath that row cover. Besides that, using chemical control, I think it's Scorpion. That's one of the bigger, battered ones, but it's effective. It's a good tool, and if you apply Scorpion, you're almost positive, yeah, it's that trade name. Then you're not going to have squash bugs. So there are tools. I think a combination of, using crop rotation and row covers and, keeping that tool in your toolbox is obviously an option. You don't want to maybe start with that, but there are good chemicals for squash bugs. All right, so some other true bugs. So psyllids, here's some drawings of them. Psyllids are very small. Some folks think they are kind of like aphids. They're related, that's for sure. They do vector certain viruses in the same way, and they are hemipterans, so they have piercing, sucking mouth parts. But in a lot of ways, to me, they're quite different. They vector psyllid yellows in potatoes or different yellows. Here's a photo of a potato psyllid larvae. So that is the feeding stage, and it's sitting and it's sucking the cells of that potato plant that's underneath it. And of course, tomato psyllids are very common. This was a very drought-stressed tomato, and we just happened to find an incredible amount of psyllids just on the I'm remembering the botanical term of that, but on some of the tissue there. Here's some damage. And of course, I think one of our last hemipterans I want to talk about in depth is the beet leafhopper. That's because this is the vector of beet curly top virus, and this is the only organism that vectors this disease, and it's a virus that it impacts many of our vegetable crops. So this basically virus is transmitted by the leafhopper because it lives within the leafhopper after these leafhoppers feed on diseased plants like kochia, for example, especially down in Mexico. There's when that area gets a lot of rain and kochia runs rampant, this insect essentially acquires the virus and they breed on this plant, and then weather moves them northward up into states. And unfortunately, last year was a terrible year in Western Colorado for beet curly top virus. I literally had a grower in the Tri-River area lose 400,000 tomatoes out of the 600,000 he had planted. So 2/3 loss. Horrible. So this is the disease. You can see it's very random in the plants that it selects. They're very stunted and yellow. I'll take you through a few crops here. This is beet curly top in pepper on the left and in pumpkin on the right. On the left, you can really see that the randomized you know, it's just those 3 plants got fed on, unfortunately, and they're very stunted and yellow. Some delay in planting can help. If you get your tomatoes out really early because you want to capitalize on some of the warm weather we've had, that can actually end up hurting you, because that's the time that beet leaf poppers are here in the environment. Folks that, and this year is a weird one because everything's delayed out here. But folks can attempt to delay their planting to avoid these migrating up from Mexico to Colorado. But essentially, when there's lots of rain on kochia in Mexico, unfortunately, they move up and they impact lots of our crop plants. So cucurbits are impacted and solanaceous crops are really impacted. So pumpkins and squash, and then tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, the latter. So this is a big deal. I'm not actually sure how bad of a year it was for La Plata last year. We'll have to have Darren comment about that at some point. But it was a really bad year for us, a little bit more north. So lepidopteran pests. So scale wing. So Lepidoptera means scale wing. So things that are moths and butterflies are caterpillars first when they're larvae. And we've got some brassica pests, so cabbage loopers and cabbage worms. Some loopers here depicted. They've got these really large holes. They'll leave ununiform sized holes in brassica plants. BT can be used. It's a really great biological control. There are certain strains of BT you'd want to be sure to use that would be more effective on this than other strains. But pyrethroids are also effective if you absolutely need to save your crop. Here's a photo of that looper kind of doing the distinctive looper walk. And then, of course, we've got cabbage worms. So different insect, they feed on the same plants, but imported cabbage worms are they're quite different in appearance. I think they look like velvet. That's a good photo showing those tiny pinacula, those tiny dots, and then just their hair is dense and velvety. But cabbage looper and cabbage worm control, some folks, depending on scale, will hand pick these off. BT, I think, is pretty much uniformly used for this. It's a great natural product against loopers and cabbage worms. It's a stomach poison, so it does need to be consumed and digested by the insects for those to for that product to work. Row covers, so you can exclude lots of pests by using row covers. I think they're really underutilized. Lots of vegetable farmers, I think, use row covers, but I think in general in the gardenscape and in other applications, you can exclude things and it can really save you a headache later. Using this fabric that light travels through, and often it's natural to have it on your plants anyway because it's cold out early in the spring at night, so it can help insulate your plants as well. So on top of that, of course, always using crop rotation to make sure that you're planting certain brassicas and certain solanaceous crops and really everything. If you can put it in a new spot next year, you should do so. So make sure you keep good records. I want to talk about the tomato fruit worm or the tobacco bollworm or the corn earworm. So this is the one insect that has 3 legitimate common names through the Entomological Society of America that names insects. And that's because it is so prolific in these different systems that it deserved different names, depending on the system we're talking. But this is a burly insect. In corn, it's our top pest of Colorado brown sweet corn. It's a big deal. It causes corn to be rejected. People don't want to open up an ear of corn and find this inside. Lots of pyrethroids are used to control these, though pyrethroid resistance is noted in lots of crops that are used as a main form of control. So our lab is actually looking into this in corn grown in Delta County, just looking at what options are out there that may be a little bit more expensive, but will hopefully stop the market corn rejects of fresh grown sweet corn. because this pest is it's one of our top ones. Talking a little bit more about caterpillars here. So we've got tobacco hornworms here, so switching systems. Many of you are familiar with these. You may have come out to your garden and found your tomatoes to look a little skeletonized, or vacant of leaves, I should say. The leaves are totally chewed and removed from tomato. And often in Colorado, I find that it's the tobacco hornworm, not the tomato hornworm, but small detail there. But they will leave these bare stems and a lot of hornworm poop, which is really distinctive. And that's how I often find them in my garden, is I will find their poop on the right-hand side, their frass, those pellets. And then I look above at the plant and I often find damage. And then right in front of me, there'll be a 3-inch worm. They blend in an incredible way. But I want to move on to some coleopteran pests here. We've got flea beetles that leave shot hole injuries in many vegetable plants. Flea beetles do require, I think, often this layer of some type of a frost cover or row protector that can really help exclude flea beetles when things are young and growing. That's really when flea beetles are the biggest issue for us. But removing any weeds or plant debris can be incredibly important. A lot of our flea beetles feed on weed species. And sometimes chemical control is even warranted. So depending on, there's many times I've planted plants and they look terrible, like the one on the left, and sometimes stuff comes back and they just really hit those cotyledons, the first leaves that emerge. And then, you know, until plants are a few inches tall, flea beetles are a real problem. So if you can keep them off your plants during that time, often you don't need to spray for flea beetles. But there are options. Spinosades, neonics, and pyrethroids are available tools to you. And then the Mexican bean beetle. This is our one true bad lady beetle or ladybug that we have. Most ladybugs, we've got over 450 species in the United States. And almost all of them are good. They're predators. They eat aphids. They eat many other insects, primarily aphids. But this is the one bad apple. The common name is the Mexican bean beetle, and it's a plant-feeding species. It does damage our commercial bean production quite significantly. And in organic production, there's not many options. In conventional, there's definitely sprays that work against this insect, but look at their unique pattern that they damage bean leaves. I find that to be actually quite beautiful and unique. I see a lot of insect damage, and this one stands out to me as very lacy and pretty. Their eggs look a lot like lady beetle eggs. You're familiar with ladybug eggs, but they have at the apex, they've got a really kind of a tannish brown section that a lot of ladybug eggs do not have. And their larvae are fascinating. Look at those spined setae, or those hairs are barbed. So that's a soft-bodied insect. That's like a juicy little snack walking around, and without any physical protection, things may eat that. Something we'll think twice about eating that with how many spines it has. So just some defense there. These are their pupae. You can see how they've pupated, and all of those spines that are on the larvae, you can see when they pupate, that is what helps to glue them to the plant. You can see their pupae don't have those spines. And then, of course, the adults, they even look like ladybugs, though they're orange, and they have a velvety texture based on the pattern of hairs they have, but they've got black spots. So this is one, I've done a variety trial on this, and a lot of the pole beans are favorites versus the bush beans, but we've seen them in bush beans too. The state of Colorado produces a lot of beans, so this is definitely a pest to be aware of. I love scarlet runner beans. I like to put them everywhere. I think they're a beautiful plant in the landscape, and these like to hit it, unfortunately. So I'm gonna have to treat my scarlet runner beans this year, or find a way to exclude these from it. So, and of course, orthopteran pests, so grasshoppers. they're some of the most familiar of all insects. We've got hundreds of them in North America. They damage plants through their chewing mouth parts. Most feeding occurs on the leaves, on the foliage of plants. But they're noted to obviously feed on grasses, but others feed on many broadleaf plants, almost all garden plants. Here's some photos of that, but many of them are generalist defoliators of many plants. So that makes them problematic. But we've got grasshoppers in Colorado in a big way, especially in Western Colorado. But there's about 15 that are considered pest species out of the 450 in the Western US, and got just under probably 80 in Colorado at this point. Many of the pests are in the Melanoplis genus. Many of them are crop pests. So these are mainly our short-horned grasshoppers. So the family Acrididae have short horns, and many of them can be quite colorful. The problem with grasshoppers is they lay their eggs in very high densities in undisturbed soil, and then they come out pretty much all at once. Depending on the species, there's different emergences in the state. So some folks will deal with one species earlier in the year, and then they're hit with another species later. Here's our primary pest grasshoppers. I'd say the two-striped and the differential grasshopper are by far the ones I see the most. This is the two-striped. Here's some details on it. I don't have lots of time here on the pest section, so let me know if you have specific questions about this. I'm happy to email you more information, but just to show you, this is Whitney's famous photo of grasshopper control using a pair of scissors. So not something I recommend, but something that I've seen Whitney Cranshaw do, and he was delighted to cut one in half. So they're it's pretty brutal, but it's meant to be humorous. But there's so many of them. This is about what you want to do to them, though it's not very effective. We've got clear-wing grasshoppers in Western Colorado, and a lot of the problems that we have with grasshoppers are because they hang out on the plant and they just strip the epidermal layers. So they remove that outer layer of plant cells, and they even bore into the stems sometimes, causing a weakened structure, and then that plant will lodge. So it'll fall over because it's not structurally sound anymore. But grasshopper control really starts with controlling their egg beds. And it can be very hard to locate where those are. But the density of certain egg laying areas are so great that if nothing's really done about it, you're going to have grasshoppers emerge. Lots of different ways grasshoppers insert and lay eggs. I find this quite beautiful, though anyone that's dealt with grasshopper problems are not excited to see that there's pods of eggs laid. That increases the numbers of grasshoppers that emerge. Here's a diagram and a photograph of an egg pod by the differential grasshopper laid in undisturbed soil. Folks, you really can solve a lot of your vegetable pest problems with row covers. I'd say grasshoppers are no different. So just keep that in mind. And with that, since I'm running out of time, I'm going to launch straight into the vegetable pollinators section. And I promise to stick around to answer anyone's questions at the end. I'm trying to respect everyone's time by getting through this next section. So I appreciate you hanging with me. I'm now going to move to discuss vegetable pollinators. So thanks for bearing with me. But there are many main groups of pollinators. These are some of our beneficial insects. So pollinators there's many animal pollinators. Before you on the slide are main groups of insect pollinators like flies and moths and butterflies and wasps, beetles and bees, and I forgot ants. But these are probably our primary groups of flower visitors and pollinators before you. But pollinators provide a service that enables plants to produce fruit, and those fruit often have seeds, and that's how the plant reproduces, is by providing its seeds in a fruit that some animal is going to come along and eat, those seeds end up getting distributed elsewhere. It helps those plants grow in new places. And about 70% of the world's plants require a pollinator. So lots of our plants, really pollinators have co-evolved with flowering plants to a large extent. So once flowering plants occurred, there was a lot of diversification in the insect kingdom. So, or insect class. So really 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food, really we can thank a pollinator for that food or for the drink there. But the importance of pollinators is it's hard to describe. Really, fruits and seeds are a major part of the diet of about 25% of birds and many other mammals. So really by insect pollinators pollinating plants, allowing them to set seed, that allows for many other species to survive because of that ability to allow plants to reproduce. They move the genetic information around on those plants that plants need to reproduce and thrive another season yet. So many native plants depend on pollinators. I said bees are debated to be the most important of our pollinators. Many of them are social. Some of them are solitary. We'll definitely get into that. I think most commonly our social bees are more well known compared to some of our native and solitary bees. But crop pollination, really, we have used the European honeybee. So many folks know what honey is and have tried it. It's delicious, and that you can thank the European honeybee for that. It's not actually a bee from the North American continent at all. So hence why I think it suffers a lot of the issues that it suffers. But one of the most incredible pollinators in terms of its capacity to be transported to pollinate our specific crop plants. They're one of the most efficient pollinators out there, and they're able to be moved around, and they can take a lot of stress from transportation versus a lot of other bees that would be used, like bumblebees are also used, that are a social organism, and they seem to do really well. They're cavity nesters, so they naturally can be put into boxes. But like I said, social bees use wax, and a lot of our social wasps, so a similar group, use actual paper. So they chew certain wood material to make nests for construction. Just figured I'd mention that. But you can see honeybees make hexagonal prisms, cells where they put an egg and then they feed a larvae honey to grow into a bee. So honey is their food too. So they work really hard to make that happen. And they use a mix of saliva and microorganisms and nectar to create honey. But the cells of a beehive are made into this honeycomb, and it's hexagonal for a reason. It's actually the most efficient use of space and their building materials, and they're the strongest shape. Regular hexagons actually fit together without any gaps, so it's a very efficient hive construction. And this is a hive I kept in college. But yeah, you can see they're kept on frames. So the Langstroth hive is built to allow for honeybees to be checked on. But unfortunately, our honeybees, as I mentioned, they suffer a lot of issues, maybe being from Europe, but a lot of it comes from what we call colony collapse disorder. And this was, about mid 2006. A lot of beekeepers really globally expressed, the loss of hives especially over the winter. And a lot of reasons for this are, we're uncertain. A lot of it's disease. I think transporting them around and only giving them one plant to pollinate it's debated. But I do think that there's a lot that goes into colony collapse disorder. A lot of it's management. But there's a big part of this talk today is the importance of native bees. So there's a lot of bees that are out there that folks don't know actually much about, and they do significantly contribute to crop pollination and native plant diversity. A lot of them have bee pollinators that aren't bumblebees or honeybees. But it's important to, I want to talk about bumblebees before I move away from social bees. But it's really important as managers of land to recognize bumblebee nesting sites or potential habitat for bumblebees, and to work hard to preserve these spaces. A lot of it is just open space or spaces on the roadside folks may not act defensively over, but these are really important spaces for our native pollinators. So bumblebees, they live in the ground, and they make annual colonies. So only the queens overwinter, and their cells are quite beautiful. They look like little honey pots to me, but they're very similar in the way that honeybees will raise their young. They create these cells, though different in shape and size. They lay an egg. The queen will lay an egg in there, and then the bumblebees will basically feed those bees a certain slurry of nectar and microorganisms that allow those larvae to develop into adult bumblebees. Let's see if this plays here. Maybe. Okay, hopefully that's playing for you. I apologize if it's not. I won't stay here too long in case it's not. But this is the inner workings of a bumblebee colony. It's always a joy when you get to witness this. Very, very. Let's see here. Let me advance. So bumblebee colonies are sold commercially. So some folks that want to witness this, you can buy bumblebees and monitor that that hive throughout the season. Often folks that are growing tomatoes will sorry, so good distraction there. But they use this type of bee because of buzz pollination. So these bumblebees vibrate at a certain frequency that it allows that pollen in that really tightly packed anther to release. And so bumblebees fly underneath the flower and grab the tomato flower in particular, and they vibrate at that special frequency that allows that pollen to drop onto their bellies. And so lots of tomato greenhouses will buy bumblebee colonies to help in fruit set and yield of their tomato plants. Okay. So yes, like these tomatoes here, for example, we use bumblebees to pollinate them. So native bees are very efficient. I think a lot of crop pollination is focused on honeybees and bumblebees and not enough on what our native bees do. But there's no rental fees, and you don't have to buy native pollinators. They're just there in the environment, and they're interacting with your plants, whether you know it or not, depending on if you have plants, of course. But research demonstrates that the contribution of native bees is significant. And like just one study I pulled from, there's 51 species recorded visiting just tomato, sunflower, and watermelon in the state of California. So there's lots of animal pollinators, especially native bees, that are out there doing good work. So most bees live as solitary organisms. So I was just going through honeybees, which are a social organism. So they live in a colony like bumblebees do and like ants do. But many hymenopterans, so bees and wasps, many of them live independently. They don't report to a queen. They don't go back to a hive. They just go back to their single cell. And this is a mass amount of bees. But native bees help to pollinate many of our plants out there. So, this is a field that has honeybee hives, but going out into that field, you don't just find honeybees. You also find native bees that are contributing to pollination. Squash bees, this is a really specific group of bees that just pollinate squash. And it was found on, certain farms that had native bees. Basically, if you were organic versus conventional, you had a lot more native bees, and they are sensitive to insecticides. But squash bees are really special. They only can survive on squash pollen. Their young needs something in that squash pollen to survive. So some of them are really specific in terms of the plants that they interact with or the group of plants, and Some of them are more general. Here's a male. Many male bees are masked with a yellow hypeus on their face. Just random fact there. But it's important to diversify. I think that, you know, if we are able to rely on fewer honeybees, the better. They're non-native and they do have lots of problems. So just to make space and to learn about native bees is important. So many native bees and native wasps nest in the soil. The majority of them do. So 70% of solitary bees live in the ground. So they form little chambers and they live in the ground. They create these cells. And Colorado has significant bee diversity nationally. We've got about a fourth of the national diversity of bees. And it's because we have so many ecosystems here in Colorado. But the majority of them are in the ground and they lay a ball of pollen and then an egg on that ball of pollen. And then a small larvae grows and then will pupate, and the next season will become a native bee. So the life cycle of a solitary bee is fairly simple. There's a cell in the ground that a ball of pollen has, and eventually it will pupate. And when time comes the following year, it emerges. Ground nest construction, depending on the species, you know, this is something we know actually quite little about. There's some drawings of the structures underground, but each species does something a little bit different. So not all of it's documented in terms of what certain cell chambers look like for some of our native bees. But bare ground is very important for them to have because they live in the ground in undisturbed soil. And there's not a lot of that around with all the asphalt and all the concrete and all of our monoculture and all of our neighborhoods. So they're definitely struggling in terms of just habitat loss. Solitary bee nests are not connected underground, but you will find them living somewhat communally. I like to think of this as when I look at a neighborhood, you know, there's lots of humans living in that neighborhood, but they all live in different houses. And that's pretty much how native bees live. They'll find suitable habitat and they'll all take advantage of it, but these are not connected underground. So there's also, you know, the other 30%. So our cavity nesters. So there's other bees that nest in cavities, and I just want to highlight leaf cutter bees. This is something we see commonly in the garden, and we may not know what's causing it. But certain leaf cutter bees actually cut leaves almost in perfect semicircles, and they use that in nest construction. So they're a cavity nester, so they don't live in the ground, so they have to go make some home somewhere using a material, and in this case, leaf cutter bees use leaves. So here's some damage of leaf cutter bees on rose, on lilac, and on Virginia creeper. So you can see it's fairly distinctive, and these leaf cuts are used really it's not origami, but it's almost more impressive. They create nests out of these leaves, and they crimp the base, and they make these perfect little cells out of certain rectangular pieces, oval pieces, and they cap it with a nearly perfect circle. And they use many plants in the environment to do this. But it's impressive to see. Most plants aren't damaged to the point where you need to worry about your plant because the bees are doing this to the leaves. It's somewhat negligible to the plant. But you can see these are different photos of David's that show that bee cutting that leaf out, and she's grasping it, and she's going to take that back and construct a nest with it. There's a leaf cutter bee collecting pollen. This shows how in this group, the megachilids, this is a group that collect their pollen on their bellies, which is a bit unique. You can see in that photo and in the figure there, where the pollen sits on those scopal hairs. So certain hairs collect that pollen. Based on the bee you're talking about, that pollen will be collected differently. So in this group, they collect it on their bellies. Here's a photo just showing how sweet pea flowers will actually smack the bee from the back. So flowers have really distinctive mechanisms for getting their pollen on that animal pollinator, so that genetic material from those anthers gets transported somewhere else unknowingly to the animal pollinator. They don't know that that's what they're doing, but that pollen is hitching a ride to the next plant, and the plant has evolved to do this. So pretty fascinating. Leafcutter bees, they can excavate into timber, but often it's just some type of soft, pithy plant that they end up digging into, and you can actually see how they hollow out that stem and they build the cells inside of it one by one. Each cell is different and they remain dormant. The females are laid deeper in the cell and the males emerge first. So they're laid in there first. They'll be the first to exit. And there are some different mechanisms for helping provide habitat to cavity nesters. You'll see these little bee homes, and keep in mind that I said cavity nesters are only 30% of our native bees. So I see products sold all the time. Oh, save the native bees and buy this. And yes, you're doing some good by providing some habitat to some wasps and, occasionally a leafcutter bee, but the majority of our native bees live in the ground. So buying this, they're probably not going to do that, right? So you can make them. I find it's an awesome activity to let people learn about native bees and get excited. I have a friend that will drill holes in her fence line, and they are used. So, I mean, by some species, just not all. And I can't exaggerate enough the value of open space and natural areas. So pollinators.
Sorry. Yeah. Real quick, there's a question in there about leafcutter bee cuts look similar to weevil damage.
Okay, interesting. I'm not sure what specific weevil, but always take pictures so you can send those to me. I appreciate them. But I think in general, the weevil damage that I see, at least I'm working in alfalfa right now, and there's tons of weevils. It's more of a skeletonizing effect. The leaf cut is very clearly, it's a semicircle and it's on the edges. If anything, I've seen other root weevils make, I guess, some cuts. So maybe it's that you're referring to, like a root weevil. I think some of
you just mentioned lilac weevil.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, but maybe we can elaborate on that.
But if it's a lilac weevil, it does present a similar cut.
It's kind of similar. Yeah, those root weevils can cut basically along the edge in a similar way, but they're more they're less of a circle and they're more of a triangular cut or more of a rectangular cut. They'll have more corners to the cut than a leafcutter bee would.
I always felt like the root weevils are pretty jagged, then kind of irregular, whereas the leafcutter bees, it is pretty amazing how their cuts are not jagged at all. They're very smooth.
Awesome. I'm sorry I'm flying through things and can't look at the chat, but any other questions before I move on?
Sorry, let me just check. I don't see it. Nope, we're all good.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for your question. It's a great point along the margins. Certain things can cut along the edges of leaves, and it can be tough to differentiate. But I like what Darren said. I think it's going to be almost a perfect circle. There's not going to be corners to that line. But yeah, value of natural areas. Pollinators need habitat. The amount of natural areas close to a farm is a major influence on the diversity and abundance of native bees, especially, but all beneficial insects. This is from a study in watermelon in California. It showed that, with more than 30% of that area, essentially. So basically, I think it's 30% of the area within that field is natural habitat. And because of that, they were able to achieve full pollination of their watermelons by just having 30% of that area be a wild space. So really fascinating, really good impacts there. So having areas that support and diversify your landscape, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to recognize these forage areas and areas of habitat. but you want to look for plants that are already supporting pollinators, and you want to incorporate those into your design of your land or on your farm in your garden. Bees need high quality sources of nectar, high quality sources of pollen, and they need nesting sites. And they really need these sources to be available throughout the year. So if I have a bunch of spring blooming flowers, I can feel good about that. But if I don't have summer blooming and fall blooming flowers, I'm only helping to solve, the problem during the spring. There's going to be different animals and different insects that rely on summer and fall plants that bloom. So keeping that in mind, you want to really diversify bloom time and type. But by strip planting pollinator plants, you can attract pollinators. So you can manipulate your landscape in a way that allow for beneficial insects to thrive. You can help support their presence there and beckon them to your property. So having a polyculture, or many plants, poly being many, and a culture, if you're able to grow a diversified landscape, you can include, you can expect, I should say, pollinators and beneficial insects to visit. We considered growing a cut flower program on a vegetable farm I was on to help improve the native bees and also the beneficial insects. And it was wildly successful. And we had a pumpkin patch just there across the field. So definitely an option. It also opened up a new avenue for us to generate income. Herb gardens. Wonderful to have herb gardens. It's also nice to have perennial plants and pollinator gardens, and lots of our herbs, some of them in Colorado are not, but a lot of them do come back, and it's nice not to replant a pollinator garden every year. And herbs can be a huge hotspot for our pollinating insects. I already kind of mentioned this. This is another example of that. Apologies for the redundancy, but it's really fun to put flowers and make the landscape beautiful, but it's even more rewarding knowing that insects are going to visit that and help make your garden a more diversified place. This was a vegetable production farm I was on before I worked for the Extension Service, and I found it to be really impactful that they had perennial flowering plants right next to where they were growing their peppers and their tomatoes. And it absolutely brought in some of those parasitic wasps and some of those flower flies, and it helped to support the adult stages of those insects that are going to lay their eggs, and then their larvae are going to grow on other plants. So it's really all connected. Certain things that you have in the landscape can support one stage of an insect, and that's often required to keep them local on your farm. So flowers can really do a great job, but mixing in herbs, and this can be done very simply, actually. It just takes a little bit of intent and some time in the spring, if you have it, to diversify things a bit farther. But you can do this at scale. This does happen. People are, I think, starting to scratch the surface of strip cropping at large acreage. How that can impact the presence of beneficial insects is profound and underutilized. And hopefully we start to really show the value of this in the research world. I think this is understudied. But even if you have a small space, you can add in flower hanging plants, or potted plants, I should say. Hanging flower baskets can help improve a space. And I want to touch on some of our scale-winged pollinators. I've talked a lot about bees, but I do want to end by talking about several groups of our moths and butterflies. So the black swallowtail is the adult as a pollinator, and as a caterpillar, it's called the parsley worm. It's one of the common names. So it's actually a pest, or thought to be a pest when it's young, and it's thought to be beneficial when it's an adult. And so the stage of the insect matters. That these eggs are often laid on dill. I always just said plant a little bit more dill and you're going to be all right. They're not a tremendous defoliator in that way, but I don't know. Some people say, their 3 dill plants got mowed down, and maybe you should plant a little bit more if you don't want to use some type of chemical control, or if you don't want to hand pick these off. just grow a little bit more dill. But the caterpillars, the photos are showing them growing. Quite a unique look when they're younger versus when they're older, so quite different. You can even see the molts in the left hand of this photo. And the later stages of that caterpillar are very different in color. They have these omasterium that come off from their head when they're disturbed, and that can basically scare off a predator. It's a scent gland mainly that they will pop it out real quick. But you can see here on the left-hand side, the parsley worm is going to pupate. It's going to become an adult butterfly by forming a chrysalid. This is the pupal form of the parsley worm. So it's changing. All of its genetics it's basically soup inside of there. The caterpillar liquefies and the genetics rearrange, and then out comes a beautiful black swallowtail. So really one of our awesome swallowtails that we have here in Colorado. We've got hummingbird moths or hornworms. I mentioned hornworms a little bit in the pest section because they are known to be pests of tomato and other plants. You can see here on the left, I believe that's the tobacco, and then the tomato hornworm in the center there with the V markings versus that are in white versus the white markings, and hopefully I haven't mixed that up. But that's how you tell them apart, is by the shape of those white markings on their body. But the horn is flexible, so they're called hornworms for this device they have on the end, and there's no known function. It's actually soft. It's like a little balloon. It looks like it would hurt you when you jab it. And I can guarantee you I've tried it many times and no success on their end. They have not hurt me with it. I think it's just a fake everybody out. I think maybe just to scare a gardener. Maybe that's the function of it. That's what Whitney always said. But yeah, the tobacco hornworm. So this is a common pest when it's young, and it's a pollinator when it's an adult. So hornworms, they lay eggs, and then in that photo in the center you can see there, it's just recently hatched from that egg. It's a young caterpillar, and it begins feeding on plants. And when it's had its fill, it's almost as fat as an actual hot dog, and then it crawls down the plant, buries itself in the ground, and it forms a pupal chamber. And the mouth parts actually form on the outside of that pupal chamber. You can see there in the figure and in the photograph. But many of our hummingbird moths or our sphinx moths, when they're young, they can be considered pest-like, and when they're adults, they're pollinators. So it's a conundrum a bit to manage these. But most sphinx moths fly only at night. You can see there are really long mouth parts that they use to drink nectar from tubular flowers that have nectar really deep within that tube. This mouth part is designed to access that nectar. There's a small amount of species that do fly during the day. And the ones that fly during the day are called hummingbird moths, because that's when you see a hummingbird visiting those plants, and that's actually what they often are mistaken for. A lot of times people, oh, what is that? And they think it's a hummingbird. It moves so fast and its wings beat really quickly like a hummingbird, but it's not. It's a moth. The white-lined sphinx here is one of our most common. You can see the white line on those wings. Another caterpillar that looks really different between when it's young on the right and when it's older on the left. And I will point out those eggs on the head on the left, those are tachinid fly eggs. So this thing, unfortunately, is doomed, because those fly eggs are going to hatch and bury themselves into the body of that caterpillar. And the caterpillar is going to be no more, unfortunately, after that. But white-lined sphinx larvae feed on lots of plants. We find it often on purslane, evening primrose, grape. Actually mainly only found on purslane, which is a small weed that grows in Colorado here. It tastes lemony, not the caterpillar, but purslane. See here, in my video, it does show the hummingbird moth. This is slowed down just a bit, and it shows how they move from flower to flower, and they use their really long proboscis to access the nectar. Very pretty. Keep your eyes open, you'll see them. Oops, apologies there. And then we also have some clear wing sphinx moths. So they lack scales on those wings. And so it just shows those just the membrane there, and they look see-through. And they really are, they're transparent, so you can see right through the wings. There's a few species, so that this one and the snowberry clearwing are two of our common species in Colorado. And here we've got the larvae of that snowberry clearwing, and I'm not going to read it, but I've got this list here of plants that hummingbird moths favor, so you can take a mental note of that. But mainly, you know, my point is, you know, farmers and gardeners of vegetables if they want to support beneficial insects, I think you should really do the following. So I think you should adapt your current practices and make simple changes. I think you can protect and value habitat if you don't already. You can create pesticide buffers and adjust application methods to do the least amount of harm by applying early, and maybe, you know, being very choosy on when you actually do apply a chemical insecticide. But you can maximize those untilled areas, and you can try to build bee habitat. You can allow your crops to bolt. I actually really like that one. Half the time they're bolting anyway, because you don't have time as a farmer that time of year. But and they're going to bolt regardless. So the flowers of those bolted plants can be a real big support to beneficial insects. I encourage you to, you know, enhance habitat and forage patches by choosing a diversity of native and naturalized plants that not only provide abundant nectar and pollen year round, but they can really help to bridge certain crops. So if one crop is blooming and there's going to be a long time before another crop is blooming, some of these patches are going to be filled with plants that will help fill in that gap. So yes, continuing on enhancing your habitat. You can build rock gardens or have xeric gardens. There's a lot of open ground that are used by pollinators. You can clear away plants to even create this space. It's hard to keep the weeds out. It's kind of a battle, but you know, mulch really thick is not going to work either. So fighting for that bare ground for those 70% of our native bees that use that. So we can try to increase, you know, no-till farming, because tillage will disrupt those bee beds. But also grasshopper beds. So always choices we are faced with managing land. You know, you can try to build out some wood nests, but remember that's just for the 30% of those cavity nesters. And you can really try to increase areas and maximize, you know, what you get out of the habitat that you do have that's more wild. So those grassy margins are important. You want to maximize those wild areas as much as you can. But flowers and vegetables are going to equal, those things together are going to equal a really interesting insect complex, good and bad. And I think having flowers in the landscape can really help fight what's bad, or the bad biology, the pest biology in vegetables. So strip cropping in those sunflowers can lead to increased pollination. This is something we've done in a few capacities. That it's amazing to see the different pollinators that visit and have pollen to take back to their nest. Here's another. But my take-home message is a diverse community of pollinators can provide significant pollination to your crops. So I think that it's worth it for you as someone trying to make money from vegetable production to do this. It's also really awesome to teach children about, and our neighbors, how habitat can support our wild pollinators, and how a lot of us are underutilizing our landscapes in ways to support these animals. So I think there's a lot of conservation programs out there. There's some great CSU fact sheets involving pollinators here. I have to point out a few other resources. Gardening for Native Bees in Utah and Beyond. This is an amazing fact sheet. Outstanding, really. I use a lot of stuff from Utah State. They're a neighboring institution, and they do a lot of stuff well. So you can always look to their fact sheets as well as CSU's. An excellent publication are the Bees in Your Backyard. This is just one of a favorite I've seen amongst a few people to give similar presentations. This is the book that comes up then and again now. Another amazing publication is Attracting Native Pollinators, and this is a Xerces Society publication. They have another one on farming for beneficial insects that's phenomenal. So both those books are must own, in my opinion, if you're interested in manipulating landscape to support pollinators. And lastly, I thank you for your time. I know that was a lot of information. I'm hopefully right on time, but I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. If you find interesting insects, please document that and send it my way. I do work in the Tri-River area as a focus, but I do work out of area across Western Colorado, and it helps me learn when you share certain photos. So please send them my way. And I'll end with just reminding you all that bugs are not going to inherit the earth when we're gone. They already own it. We might as well make peace with the land. So thank you very much, Darren. Thanks for having me, La Plata County, and I hope you have a great evening, but I'll stick around for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I have a quick question. When it comes to what flowers we plant, you know, or what plants we plant in terms of acting as those pollinator species, is there any data out there saying that some of our native pollinators are more attractive to native plants, or does it matter if they're hybrids or cultivated plants, or if they're native plants within our landscape? Do you know if there's a difference?
You know, different research points in different directions, but I think it's interesting. And we've always had this debate with like, the native insects that we would see on invasive weeds. You know, how is that weed being present in the environment, or maybe a native plant, you know, instead in its place? How does that impact the choice of those, you know, native pollinators? Yes, they're getting pollen from that invasive weed. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing that we're changing the available pollen that they're foraging from? It's interesting to look across the landscape and really try to figure out what are the best plants for these pollinators, because some plants that are outside their scope of normally foraging from are going to provide pollen to them. It's just, I think overall, if we can use native plants, great. But there's other plants out there, I guess, to your point, that they do forage from, and they can. So I think that it depends on where you look.
Right. So if you put like a salvia next to a penstemon, similar flower shapes, is that mason bee or that leaf cutter going to go to the penstemon, or is it going to go to the salvia, or is it just going to forage on everything? Is it? I'm always curious what
same, and
that difference would be.
The research points in different directions, really, from what I'm able to tell. But that's not super helpful. But
okay. And just so everyone knows, I'm recording this, so I'll make it available hopefully by tomorrow. If you want to go to our website, which I'll just throw in the chat real quick, I'll have it up there. Again, it'd be like a YouTube video, and hopefully I can get it loaded tomorrow. Does anybody else have questions for Mel? Give everyone a second to think about it, and then a second if they want to copy that. If they don't have the website, it's also on my email. If you probably got it from me, if you're on here, you probably got my email. So, if not, Mel, I want to thank you again for taking time out of your evening. It means a lot to all of us. And
yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Yeah. So, if you guys got photos, trust me, she's really good at getting back to you. If you have unknowns, feel free to send to me, and I can filter before they go up to Mel. But yeah, we love to have your information down here and your knowledge. So thank you.
Yeah.